Below is a long English story script about King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, known as the Leper King. He became king in 1904 at about 13, suffered from leprosy, ruled Jerusalem until 195, and is remembered for resisting Saladin and holding the kingdom together despite illness and political division. In the burning light of Jerusalem, where the stones of the city seemed to remember every prayer, every sword, every tear, and every drop of blood ever offered beneath the sky of God, there rose a young king whose body was wounded before his reign had truly begun, yet whose soul seemed forged beneath the shadow of the cross. His name was Baldwin, the fourth king of Jerusalem by that name, son of Amalric, heir to a throne surrounded by enemies, ambition, betrayal, sacred duty, and the terrible silence of destiny. He was not born into peace. He was born into a kingdom that stood like a candle in a storm, a Christian crown placed upon a city desired by empires, guarded by knights, monks, pilgrims, nobles, priests, widows, merchants, and soldiers who knew that every dawn might bring war to the gates. Jerusalem was not simply a city to them. It was the city of the Passion, the place where Christ had carried the cross, the place where the tomb had been found empty, the place where heaven and earth seemed to meet in stone, incense, blood, and prayer. To be king there was not merely to sit on a throne. It was to kneel before God while holding a sword. It was to understand that a crown could shine like gold before men and still feel like iron before the Lord. When Baldwin was a boy, people saw in him the promise of nobility. He was intelligent, sharp-eyed, disciplined, and unusually serious for his age. Under the teaching of learned men, especially those who knew history, scripture, and the fragile politics of the Holy Land, he grew not only in knowledge but in awareness. He learned that a king must speak carefully, listen deeply, and never confuse the applause of men with the judgment of God. Yet there was something hidden in him, something that first appeared not as thunder, but as a strange silence. As a child, he played with other boys, and one day, while they tested one another in childish games of pain and courage, Baldwin did not cry out when he should have cried out. A pinch, a scratch, a wound that should have caused pain seemed to pass through him like wind across stone. Those around him noticed. At first, perhaps they hoped it meant nothing. But the truth slowly approached like a shadow at sunset. The boy had leprosy. For another prince, such news would have destroyed the future. For Baldwin, it became the beginning of a different kind of kingship. His body would weaken, his limbs would fail, his face would change, his hands would lose their strength, and one day his sight would be threatened by the merciless progress of disease. But there was one part of him that illness could not conquer: his will to remain faithful. He did not choose his suffering, but he chose what his suffering would mean. In a world that often measured kings by strength of arm, beauty of face, and power to produce heirs, Baldwin would be measured by something higher and more terrible: the strength of a soul that refused to abandon the cross. When his father died and the crown came to him, Baldwin was still a boy. Around him stood men older, stronger, wealthier, and more experienced than he was. Some looked at him with pity, others with calculation, others with loyalty, and others with fear. The kingdom needed a warrior, and God had given it a sick child. The kingdom needed unity, and the court was filled with factions. The kingdom needed a future, and its king carried a disease that made marriage, succession, and long life uncertain. Yet in that fragile boy, there was something the kingdom did not fully understand. Baldwin did not see the throne as a privilege. He saw it as a burden placed upon him by providence. He did not ask, "Why must I suffer?" as much as he asked, "How shall I serve while I suffer?" And that question made him dangerous to despair. The streets of Jerusalem were filled with the sound of prayer bells, market voices, horses, armor, and pilgrims speaking many tongues. Men and women came from distant lands to touch holy stones, to kneel where Christ had suffered, to weep at the holy sepulchre, to lift their eyes toward heaven and believe that forgiveness was possible. Baldwin understood that their faith was part of his responsibility. He was not merely defending walls. He was defending a spiritual memory. He knew that Jerusalem did not belong to his pride. It belonged to God. And because of that, he could not treat kingship as a game of noble houses. Every decision had weight. Every alliance mattered. Every betrayal could open a gate. Every moment of weakness could invite destruction. Beyond the borders of the kingdom rose the power of Saladin, a leader of discipline, vision, and patience. Saladin was not a foolish enemy. He was not a shadow in a simple story. He was a great commander, a man capable of uniting forces and waiting for the right hour. He understood that Jerusalem was vulnerable not only because of armies outside its walls, but because of division within. Baldwin understood this too, and so the young king, sick in body but clear in mind, learned that his war would be fought on two fronts: against the armies approaching from beyond the desert, and against the pride, jealousy, and ambition inside his own court. There were knights who loved glory more than wisdom. There were nobles who loved influence more than unity. There were men who spoke of the cross but bowed secretly before their own hunger for power. Baldwin saw them. He was young, but he was not blind in spirit. He knew that a kingdom can fall long before an enemy enters its gates. It falls when truth is traded for convenience, when duty becomes performance, when men who should kneel before God begin to worship themselves. In this, Baldwin's leprosy became, strangely, a kind of mirror. His body showed openly what sin does secretly. Disease consumed the flesh. Pride consumed the soul. And he feared the second sickness more than the first. As the years passed, Baldwin's condition worsened. There were mornings when pain and weakness must have greeted him before any servant did. There were days when the act of standing like a king required more courage than riding into battle. Yet he appeared when he was needed. He listened to counsel. He judged disputes. He watched the movements of armies. He carried the loneliness of knowing that many around him were already thinking beyond him, already imagining the kingdom after his death. A sick king hears the future, whispering in other men's voices. He sees how quickly loyalty can become calculation. He understands that some hands helping him rise may also be reaching toward his crown. Still, Baldwin did not surrender to bitterness. That is what made him great. Suffering can make a man cruel when he believes the world owes him comfort. But suffering can make a man holy when he offers it beneath the cross. Baldwin's life was not perfect, and no earthly king is free from error, but the center of his story is unmistakable. He remained. He remained at his post when his body begged for rest. He remained king when others might have hidden behind illness. He remained defender of Jerusalem when the kingdom needed a symbol stronger than fear. He remained faithful when the cross he carried was not made of wood but of flesh, nerves, fever, shame, and loneliness. Then came the hour that would burn his name into memory. The threat of Saladin and the road to battle. The kingdom was in danger, and the young king, still only in his teenage years, faced a test that would have broken many seasoned rulers. Saladin's army moved with confidence. The Christian forces were greatly outnumbered. Men looked toward Baldwin and saw a boy marked by disease. But Baldwin looked toward the cross and saw something stronger than numbers. In the Christian imagination of that age, battle was not merely strategy. It was a spiritual trial. The relic of the true cross was carried with the army, a sign not of magical certainty but of desperate faith. Men who might have trembled at the size of the enemy were reminded that Christ had conquered not by worldly strength but through sacrifice. Baldwin rode out not as a healthy conqueror but as a wounded servant of God. Imagine the sight, the hot wind lifting dust beneath the hooves, the armor flashing beneath the sun, priests murmuring prayers, knights gripping reins, banners moving like flames, and at the heart of it all a young leper king, his body already touched by decay, riding beneath the sign of salvation. To the world weakness, to faith a mystery. For what is the cross itself if not the place where apparent defeat becomes victory? What is Calvary if not the throne where suffering love overthrows the arrogance of darkness? At Montjazerd, the Christian force struck with astonishing force and surprise. The battle became one of the great moments of Baldwin's reign, remembered because the young king, against expectation, helped deliver his kingdom from immediate disaster. The victory did not end the larger struggle. It did not make Jerusalem safe forever, but it revealed something that no disease could erase. Baldwin was not an empty crown. He was a king. His body might have been failing, but his courage was alive. His enemies could count soldiers, horses, supplies, and distances, but they could not easily measure the power of a soul that believed its duty came from God. After the victory, praise could have swallowed him. Many men become proud after triumph, especially when triumph follows humiliation. But Baldwin had a teacher stronger than praise: his illness. Leprosy reminded him daily that all earthly glory fades. A crown cannot stop the body from dying. A throne cannot command the flesh to remain young. A king may defeat an army and still lose the strength of his hand. And so Baldwin's greatness did not come from pretending he was invincible. It came from knowing he was not. He understood the truth that many rulers never learn. Power is temporary, but faithfulness is eternal. As his disease advanced, the court grew more restless. Questions of succession became urgent. Who would rule after Baldwin? Who could hold the kingdom together? Who could face Saladin? Who could command the nobles? These questions became knives hidden beneath velvet. Marriages, alliances, rivalries, and ambitions tightened around the dying king. His sister Sibylla, her marriages, the ambitions of powerful lords, the presence of figures like Raymond of Tripoli and Guy of Lusignan, the influence of families and factions, all of it created a dangerous web. Baldwin, still young but already old in suffering, had to navigate human weakness while his own body betrayed him. There is a special agony in being responsible for a future one may never see. Baldwin knew he would likely die young. He knew he might not leave a son. He knew the kingdom could fracture after him. And yet he did not throw up his hands and curse the burden. He worked. He planned. He judged. He tried to secure the succession. He sought stability where others sought advantage. His kingship became an act of resistance not only against enemies, but against chaos itself. Picture him in the palace at night when Jerusalem quieted and the lamps burned low. Outside, the city breathed under the stars. Somewhere monks prayed. Somewhere guards watched the walls. Somewhere pilgrims slept after weeping at holy places. Baldwin, perhaps unable to sleep, would have known that every one of those lives rested in part upon decisions made by men who were often vain, divided, and afraid. He would have known that his own time was short. And perhaps in those hours, he understood Christ more deeply than many strong men ever could. Christ in Gethsemane, Christ abandoned, Christ carrying the cross when the body was exhausted, Christ crowned not with gold but with thorns. Baldwin's crown was not thorn, yet suffering pressed into it. His throne was not Calvary, yet sacrifice stood behind it. His kingdom was not heaven, yet it pointed toward holy things. A lesser man might have hidden his face. A lesser man might have drowned himself in luxury. A lesser man might have said, "I am sick, let others rule." But Baldwin did not measure duty by comfort. He had learned that God does not ask every servant to carry the same cross, but he does ask each servant to carry the one given to him. Baldwin's cross was kingship in a dying body. His cross was to lead men who did not always obey him. His cross was to defend a holy city while knowing that after his death others might lose what he preserved. His cross was to be pitied by some, underestimated by others, and watched by all. He carried it. As the years moved toward their tragic end, Baldwin's illness became more severe. Reports describe a king increasingly disabled, unable to function as he once had. Yet even then, his presence mattered. In medieval kingship, the body of the king was a symbol of the realm. Baldwin's wounded body became the image of Jerusalem itself, afflicted, surrounded, fragile, yet still standing. The city and the king resembled one another. Both were scarred. Both were threatened. Both seemed unlikely to endure. And yet under Baldwin, Jerusalem did not fall. That fact alone gave his life a solemn power. The tragedy of Baldwin is not only that he suffered. Many suffer. The tragedy is that he suffered while surrounded by a kingdom that needed more time, more unity, more wisdom, more holiness than it possessed. He was like a lamp burning in a room full of men arguing about who would own the darkness after the flame went out. He could delay disaster, but he could not make every heart faithful. He could command armies, but he could not command humility. He could arrange succession, but he could not guarantee virtue in those who would inherit power. Here his story becomes not merely history but warning. A kingdom can be saved by courage for a season, but if pride remains, disaster waits. And yet Baldwin's life should not be remembered only through the fall that came after him. His reign deserves to be seen for what it was, a struggle of extraordinary endurance. While he lived, he remained a center of unity. While he lived, Jerusalem continued to stand. While he lived, Saladin's expansion met a king who, though physically broken, refused to be spiritually defeated. That is why Baldwin's story still speaks. He was not the strongest king in body. He was not the longest reigning. He did not build an empire. He did not leave behind a golden age of peace. But he left something rarer, the image of a wounded ruler who did not run from the cross. For a Christian audience, Baldwin's life carries a deep lesson. Faithfulness is not proven only when the road is easy. Anyone can speak of God when the body is healthy, the future is bright, and honor surrounds them. But what happens when the body fails? What happens when friends disappoint, enemies gather, and the future darkens? What happens when prayer does not remove the thorn but gives strength to endure it? Baldwin's life answers with a silent command: remain faithful. Hold the cross. Do not abandon your post. Do not confuse suffering with rejection by God. Sometimes suffering becomes the altar on which courage is offered. There must have been people in his time who saw his leprosy as shame. Some may have wondered why God allowed such a king to rule Jerusalem, but the mystery of God often overturns human expectations. The Lord who chose David from the fields, who spoke through prophets rejected by their people, who allowed his own son to be crucified between criminals, can also reveal strength through a leper king. Baldwin's disease did not make him holy by itself. Sickness alone does not sanctify a person, but his response to sickness, his endurance, his sense of duty, his refusal to abandon the cross, gave his suffering meaning. The cross is the center of his story because the cross is the place where love remains when escape is possible. Christ could have called legions of angels, yet he remained. Baldwin could have retreated into helplessness, yet he remained. Christ was mocked as powerless while accomplishing redemption. Baldwin was seen as weak while preserving a kingdom. The comparison must be made carefully, because no king equals Christ, but every Christian life is called to reflect him in some small way. Baldwin reflected him not by perfection, but by endurance beneath suffering. Imagine the young king entering the church of the Holy Sepulchre. The air thick with incense, the lamps glowing like small stars, the chant of clergy rising and falling, pilgrims kneeling, touching stone, whispering prayers for forgiveness. Baldwin, marked by disease, approaches the place where Christians believed death itself had been defeated. What does a dying king pray in the place of resurrection? Perhaps he prays not first for healing, but for strength. Perhaps he prays for Jerusalem. Perhaps he prays for wisdom against enemies and traitors. Perhaps he prays for the grace not to hate his own suffering. Perhaps he looks at the cross and understands that the King of Kings wore wounds after rising from the dead. The risen Christ did not erase the marks of sacrifice. He transformed them. Baldwin's wounds were not glorious in themselves, but offered to God. They became part of his witness. The political world around Baldwin was harsh. Medieval Jerusalem was not a simple paradise of holy knights. It contained greed, rivalry, cruelty, courage, devotion, prayer, compromise, and ambition. There were men who sincerely loved God and men who used holy language for worldly goals. There were brave warriors and reckless troublemakers. There were wise counselors and dangerous fools. Baldwin had to rule all of them. His story becomes more powerful when we do not make his world too clean. He was not ruling a painting. He was ruling a real kingdom with real sin, real danger, real hunger for power. And in that world he had to choose again and again to act as king. His enemy Saladin also should not be reduced to a caricature. Baldwin faced a formidable opponent, a leader whose rise changed the balance of power in the Near East. That made Baldwin's endurance even more remarkable. He was not fighting weakness. He was resisting strength. He was not preserving Jerusalem against disorganized raiders only, but against a growing political and military force capable of surrounding the kingdom strategically. The fact that Baldwin, with his illness and divided court, still managed to hold the kingdom together reveals the seriousness of his character. Yet history is honest. Baldwin could not defeat death. No king can. By the final stage of his life, his body was exhausted. The disease had taken too much. The young king who once rode beneath the sun now faced the last enemy not on a battlefield, but in the quiet decline of flesh. His reign ended when he was still very young. He died before reaching the age at which many rulers are only beginning to understand power. But Baldwin had lived more intensely than many who survive into old age. He had carried a kingdom, a disease, a crown, and a cross. When he died, Jerusalem did not immediately vanish, but the unity he had preserved began to fail. The years after him revealed how much had depended upon his presence. Soon the kingdom would face catastrophe at Hattin, and Jerusalem itself would fall to Saladin in Monteison. But that later disaster should not erase Baldwin's achievement. Rather, it shows the truth of it. While he lived, the kingdom had a center. After him, the weakness of men became harder to restrain. Baldwin was like a final wall of discipline holding back a flood. What makes him powerful for a video is not merely that he was a leper king. It is that he was a Christian king whose suffering made his loyalty visible. Modern viewers understand pain. They understand bodies that betray them, futures that collapse, people who disappoint them, burdens they did not choose. Baldwin's story tells them, you can be wounded and still be called. You can be weak and still be brave. You can be afraid and still faithful. You can carry a cross that no one else understands and still serve God with dignity. He is not a saint officially honored everywhere like Louis Six, but as a dramatic figure of Christian history, Baldwin IV stands almost alone. He is the king whose face was marked by disease, but whose memory is marked by courage. He is the boy who became king too early, the ruler who suffered too much, the warrior who rode when he should have rested, the guardian of Jerusalem who knew that his throne stood in the shadow of Calvary. His life is a warning to proud rulers and a comfort to suffering believers. To the proud, he says, strength fades, crowns fall, and only faithfulness remains. To the suffering, he says, your wounds do not make your life useless. God can still ask greatness of a broken body. If this story were told as a cinematic opening, it would begin not with a battle, but with silence. A child standing in the sunlight of Jerusalem, unable to feel pain in his arm. A teacher watching with fear. A father unaware that his heir carries a hidden sentence. Then the bells of Jerusalem. Then the cross. Then a crown placed upon a boy who already belongs partly to suffering. From there the story would rise. Court intrigue, the shadow of Saladin, the young king learning command, the army marching under the relic of the cross, Montjesard blazing like a miracle in the desert, and then the slow darkening of his body as his spirit refuses to bow. The final image should not be only Baldwin dying. It should be Jerusalem at dawn, the stones glowing pale gold, the church of the Holy Sepulchre quiet, a sword resting beside a crown, a cross standing above both, and a voice saying, some kings are remembered because they conquered lands. Some are remembered because they built palaces, but Baldwin IV is remembered because when his body collapsed, his faith did not. When fear surrounded Jerusalem, he did not abandon the cross. When disease took his strength, duty remained. And when history looked for a king who could suffer and still stand, it found the Leper King of Jerusalem. In the end, Baldwin's greatness was not that he escaped suffering. He did not. It was not that he healed his kingdom forever. He could not. It was not that he overcame every enemy. No earthly king does. His greatness was that he remained faithful in the place where God had set him. That is the heart of his story. That is why his name still carries fire. In a world obsessed with perfect bodies, easy victories, and comfortable faith, Baldwin IV reminds us that the cross is not carried by the comfortable alone. Sometimes it is carried by a sick young king, riding beneath the burning sky, with Jerusalem behind him, enemies before him, death within him, and God above him.